Welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. We're doing a special webinar of Checkride tips, and we've subtitled this one Low-Hanging Fruit. In fact, we actually have had another subtitle below that, Simple Things That You Might Overlook. We're not going to be talking about how to do chandelles or how to do S-turns or the proper way to do shorter soft field operations. We're going to be focusing in, drilling down to the little things that are so easy to do. They might not even be in the ACS, but they're things that will really smooth your check ride, make it easier for you, and impress the examiner too, hopefully. Now, we're really lucky tonight to have this program put on in affiliation with SAFE. And the SAFE director or chairman, David St. George, is with us on the panel. So he's going to be our examiner, giving us the examiner perspective on all of this. So here we all are. Nate has briefly escaped Atlanta. He's out in Austin, Texas. Nate, you need to come on back here now. You're having too much fun out there. And then David is calling in and with us from Ithaca, New York. So how are you guys doing tonight?
Great, Russ. Thank you for having us.
Okay.
Doing awesome,
right,
man. Great to be here.
Okay. Well, we're going to have a lot of fun. I want you people watching to send us your comments using hashtag AskGoldSeal. Let's see if we can make this more of a dialogue than a monologue. Let's get a conversation going. We'll be monitoring your tweets and your Facebook posts to hashtag AskGoldSeal, and we'll be trying to answer those questions as we go along. David, why don't you tell us a little bit about SAFE, and let's get started with what SAFE has to offer the CFIs or aviation educators.
Aviation educator, yes. Well, SAFE is an all-volunteer, not-for-profit organization, 501c3 educational, and being all volunteers, we love events like this because we can get the word out to people. The acronym stands for Society of Aviation and Flight Educators, and we really like to point out that education is what it's about. It's not so much instructing, which when I learned to be a CFI, we had a blue book we called Good Dog, Bad Dog. It was all behaviorism, but we've evolved further than that. And we're trying to raise the level of professionalism of the educators through use of resources, government advocacy, mentoring, and impact aviation safety exponentially by getting to the CFIs and in that way affecting the students and clients.
Okay, well, it's a great organization. I think we've got a lot of members in SAFE, and this webinar, maybe if we have some instructors watching, perhaps you'll have some comments to chime in and join in with us to discuss too. Now, the first document that any pilot or candidate has to be thinking about when he's going for a check ride is the Airman Certification Standards, the ACS. It's broken up into areas of operation, and within those we have individual tasks. We're not going to try to go through all of these, but I think David will probably have some comments about students coming to check rides and occasionally not being familiar with a document, or at the very least possibly not knowing what some of the performance requirements are. Do you see much of that, David? Hopefully not.
Well, yeah, you know that, Russ. I'm sure you've been in the business long enough. That is the first sign of danger if we hear or see a student come in with a PTS instead of an ACS. But in fact, you know, when we do the interview for the appointment, we're required to make sure they're familiar with that and that they are familiar with the standard. And then in the pre-test briefing, we're going to go through all that and make sure that that is, you know, understood to be the rules of engagement. The ACS is not that new now. In fact, it's a year old and going on its second version. So something every pilot and every CFI should be familiar with.
Yeah, gotcha. And in fact, the second version will be out June, I believe it's June 12th for private.
That's
and
correct.
I believe for commercial. I'm not sure about instruments,
Yep.
but I believe those two are coming out if you're watching this live tonight in the next couple of weeks. So if you have a check ride coming up after that date, make sure that you're training now using the upcoming ACS. And Nate, as a CFI, how do you go about incorporating the ACS into your training? Is it just normally happen as a part of the function, or do you actually, how do you tie that in?
Well, like you both mentioned, it's kind of the first document that you want to really show to a student when we start training. because it is what everything that we're going to do is sort of based around. And it's kind of the natural progression from what the PTS used to be. It's changing the standards from, simple check marks that you can check off as you advance through your training, to something that's a little bit more comprehensive and makes you a better, more rounded pilot, switching the focus really to risk management. And as an instructor, that's great for us, because that's what you want in your pilot anyway, is to make a safe, effective pilot that can mitigate risk effectively throughout their career. And there's not a ton of differences as far as what you do in your instructing style. There's a few small things. One of the major ones is maneuvering during slow flight, rather than keeping the stall horn on while you're going through. You're required to maintain a certain airspeed, so you're not actually going to hit the stall horn. So it's all in the matter of safety that really the ACS has evolved.
Gotcha. Now, one of the first people who are going for a private pilot check ride, their first time going through a practical test, one of their big questions is, what can I do to mess this up, or what should I not do? And in the ACS, in Appendix A, they're quite clear about the reasons that check rides might not go as planned. David, I know you've got these 5 or 6 items memorized. Can you just kind of walk us through these, so for people who maybe haven't taken a check ride before, they know what to be watching for, what they need to do or not do?
Well, it used to be special emphasis items in the PTS, and now in the ACS, it's pretty much embedded in every one of those elements and areas of operation. The big joke, usually is "don't scare me" as an examiner. But obviously, anytime the examiner has to intervene verbally or take to controls, it's going to be an unsuccessful check ride. And just because it's unsuccessful, I think everyone knows, one element can be unsuccessful and you can continue the check ride, or you can finish it and just test off the one area that's unsuccessful. Failure to clear is very common. People fail to look out the window. The ACS, more than anything, embedded judgment into what used to be the PTS, so that we're expecting pilots at every point to show good judgment. It's kind of a hard call for the examiner too, but it gives us also a tool to make sure that the pilot who's flying is doing it at a more of a correlation application level, not just a rote wiggle the stick level. But if someone violates the standard, if they go through 100 feet up or down, it's not an immediate failure. And a lot of people get very anxious and nervous when they touch the edge of that. But failure to promptly correct is what the document says. So if you exceed 100 feet up or down, 10 degrees left or right, and you're promptly correcting back to the standard, you're doing fine. So when you exceed a tolerance, it's not an immediate failure. Take prompt corrective action. The bottom one that you see on the screen there, the risk management, that's sort of the new one in the ACS, and we're looking carefully and largely evaluating that by use of scenarios. Different examiners use different versions. A lot of them will use one overriding scenario and keep playing that one scenario along. We're flying to a wedding, you're taking this and this and this, and what's the weight? And we're looking for risk management at every point in the flight, because it's obviously what gets pilots in trouble. It's what we see in accidents, so we're looking very carefully for that.
Okay, so I think the big takeaway is, if you're a private pilot going for your first check ride, you don't have to be concerned that if you exceed the tolerances on 1 or 2 items that it's over. The key word is consistently exceeding and not making the proper corrections. You want to see people. You don't mind seeing people make a mistake as long as they correct it, right?
Well, yeah, and that's we've talked offline, but the idea is that no one's going to be perfect on that day, and a lot of pilots go into it just with this idea that it's going to be 100%, but really it's pass fail. And if you're doing pretty good on everything, we're going to have a good day. But you can't totally drop it on the floor on one item, and 500 feet up or down on a steep turn is just not going to work out. So what I tell people is, it's like throwing darts, and we have to get them all on the target. They're not all going to hit the bullseye, but they all got to be within acceptable.
I hear you.
Yeah, and I think that's important for every student going in on a check ride to really know, because most pilots that I know of anyway are pretty perfectionist type
Yep.
people. Tends to be that way. It's kind of like if you ask a pilot, what are the top 2 pilots in the world, they'll have trouble naming the other one. It's that kind of scenario sometimes.
Well, when somebody comes in and they're getting started, and again, if you're getting ready for an instrument or a commercial or an ATP check ride, you've done this before, you know the story. But if this is your first practical test, walking in the door with everything in an envelope, all your everything from your logbooks to your 8710 to your check for the examiner, having all that stuff together smooths the way, makes it go easier. Everybody in agreement on that? I know, Nate, that you specifically go through with your guys and make sure that they have everything all squared away. Even logbooks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll show you right here. If you look at a logbook that I've got for one of my students, I've got everything tabbed at the top, all the different FTD times or endorsements, last flight. And then I've got everything labeled earmarked on the side too, so the examiner can go say, training per 61-129 Bravo 4, and it's got a tab on there because those are listed in the FARs, so that way they can open their FAR aim. This is what's required. Here's what I've got. It's earmarked in my logbook. It makes the whole process take 20 minutes rather than an hour, and that's really a mark on the instructor. I've talked to David about this before. It's one of those things where it's the instructor's job to really prepare the student. And if the student doesn't have the right paperwork, if they don't have things earmarked, if they don't have things tabbed and ready to go and quick to access with the maintenance logs and their logbook, that just looks really bad on the instructor. And you as a student, if you're watching as a student and you're about to go take a check ride, really take it upon yourself to kind of corner your instructor and say, look, man, I want to go in and make sure that I've got all of this really locked down and ready to go. So put that on your instructor, because he's there to help you for that, or he or she is there to help you for that.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, before we move on into the oral exam, let's see if we've got some questions here that we can take. All right. Elizabeth has written in. She says, if my written for the commercial was taken in March, will the check ride be using the PTS or the ACS? Well, I know the answer to that one. But anybody want to tackle it? David, why don't you take this one?
Thank you, first of all, Elizabeth, for writing in. I've seen you on Facebook frequently. I appreciate your participating. The ACS goes into effect June 12th. Every test after that is going to be with the ACS. So you're going to be sort of in between, because you did the knowledge test with the old questions, but the ACS is what you'll test with.
Okay. All right, good. Thanks, Elizabeth. We're taking questions, so please hashtag #AskGoldSeal, and we'll keep this thing going as a dialogue. Okay, so we've talked about coming prepared to your check ride, having everything together, getting those aircraft logbooks tabbed so you can show where the annual inspection was done without having to fumble around and get all nervous. Checklist usage is something that's used or mentioned throughout the the ACS, and in so many places, it's possible that producing a checklist and trying to go through a checklist during flight might become a distraction in itself. David, tell us how you as an examiner look at checklists and how you expect candidates to handle checklist usage in a practical test.
Well, checklists are mentioned, I think, 20 sometimes. I did a search of the document and it comes up pretty frequently. So we want you to, in all normal operations, to be using a checklist. And it can be a flow and then check. It doesn't have to be, a think and do kind of situation. But certain areas where a checklist might be inappropriate would be in an emergency situation where the engine is suddenly stopped. There are, for every manufacturer, usually immediate action items in bold, like get to best glide, check the fuel, check the carb, heat, switch tanks, pump on. Those are usually going to be something the examiner wants to see you do, get the plane trimmed up, find a place, and now, if time allows, go through the checklist. So that would be, the most obvious time when a checklist might be inappropriate for immediate consultation.
Okay, we've actually got a graphic here showing where the checklist is mentioned throughout the ACS. So let's see if we can pull that one in and just take a quick look at it and run down through them. There we are. Okay, so these are all the places. Now, this is the private pilot checklist, but you can pretty much figure that if in any practical test you go to, you're going to see the checklist mentioned on these items. Pre-flight inspection, yeah, of course you're going to use a checklist. That's what they're going to be looking for. Engine start, there's all the time in the world. You always use a checklist, hopefully, for your engine starts anyway. Before takeoff, you're used to doing that. After takeoff, though, if you're used to flying, you know, a trainer, a 172, or a Piper Warrior, or something like that, after takeoff, generally you're climbing out, and you may tend to go to that checklist, or go more to a memorized set of items. David, how do you draw the line there about when to do the checklist or when to go from a memory flow?
Boy, I'll tell you, you might find a little difference between examiners, and that's why we'll often discuss that very thing before the test in the oral when we do the pre-flight briefing. We're required as examiners to do 3 briefings before the test, before flight, after and so we'll often cover that. But my personal preference is that, you know, after takeoff, people are watching for traffic, clearing the area, talking to the controller, and then as, you know, we get to you know, maybe a cruise climb and the workload is dropped, that's when we get to the checklist. And Nate, for your turbine experience coming up, you'll have a company policy on that might be different from one company to another. So there's a little variation there, but handle the, you know, immediate fly the plane and then consult the checklist. Okay,
sounds good. Nate, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I was going to say, yeah, just having the checklist ready also, it's not in the nowhere in the ACS does it say where do you put your checklist, right? So when you're sitting in the cockpit and you've got the checklist, I see a lot of guys, you know, they might stick it up on the dash or under the visor or down here. Have a place where it's going to be easy for you to get to and easy to access. The last thing that you want is to get up with your examiner and you're already a little bit nervous, so you might not be thinking about you know, where's my checklist? Where did I put it? Have it in a place that is just ready to go and accessible. Think about that before you get into the Checkride, so that way you've got, and you should have this for normal operations anyway. You should always have, you know, quick access to your checklist, but especially on the exam, have it tabbed out for the emergencies. I always put a little red tab on a paper checklist if it's one that folds or even a single piece of paper. Highlighted, or if it's a spiral book, have it tabbed out. Have all your checklists ready so that you don't have to fumble when it comes time to, you've gone up in cruise and you go, oh crap, I forgot my cruise checklist, and you've got to search the cockpit for it. You want to make, that's what I have to offer really on checklist usage in the Checkride.
Okay, all right, makes sense. Okay, so we've used our checklist, we've got the engine started. One thing that we have to do, and it's not only in the ACS, there's actually a FAR that requires it, it's 91.517, is the passenger briefing. Now, that's something you'll do in your practical test, and there's normal items that you add in there, like, you know, how to take off your seat belts, how to exit the aircraft, where's the emergency equipment. But Nate, can you think of a couple of items that someone in a Checkride might actually want to add to a normal passenger briefing in order to help, not necessarily impress the examiner, but to let the examiner know that I've got this stuff in my head? A couple of other items that he might want to add.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It really starts before you start the engine, right? So the new ACS really goes by risk management. And so what you want to tell your examiner, and what I encourage my students to say in their Checkride, is use the words risk management, literally, when you can. And as soon as you get in the plane, before you start the engine, you'll give your passenger briefing. And you're going to say all the normal things that you're used to saying, like where's the fire extinguisher, where are the exits, here's how the seat belts work. But certain things that aren't in the ACS that will really impress your examiner will be something like positive exchange of controls. You want to tell the examiner, you know, this will be a 3-part exchange of controls, my controls, your controls, confirmed my controls, and really walk them through that step by step. You also want to say that we're going to have a sterile cockpit while we taxi to the run-up area. again, not part of the ACS, but definitely something to impress your examiner, to let them know that you've got safety on the brain and on the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it reinforces it to you, because when you say something, it kind of gets it back in your forefront. So saying these things, sterile cockpit, positive exchange of controls, and adding these to the passenger briefing, probably not a bad idea. Okay, so we've got the airplane started, and we're taxiing out to the run-up area. What are some of the things that we might do, not necessarily in the ACS, but things that we should be concerned about during the taxi operation? Now, we have to remember that this is a very low workload time. There's not a reason in the world that we can't try to score 100 and really stack the deck in our favor during these low stress periods. The taxi is a great time to do things right. So things that we might want to do, you're probably used to checking the brakes once the airplane starts to move. Nate has a comment about that one. How hard do we hit the brakes, Nate?
Just enough so it doesn't spill the coffee. One of my first check rides, my private check ride, I was so nervous, and I took off with the examiner, and we started taxiing out, and I tapped the brakes, and he goes, "Well, the flight attendant just spilled the coffee everywhere. Nicely done, Captain." And from then on, I've always said when we brake, we just don't spill the coffee.
Yeah, you don't have to bring the airplane to a complete halt. All we're doing is just checking the brakes to make sure that we have equal braking pressure on both wheels. Taxi diagrams, that's something that's in there, and that's something that even if it's an airport that is, you know it like the back of your hand, you should have a taxi diagram out and be using it. I think we've got a graphic here. Let's pop that graphic up if we can. So
yeah, and also briefing
ahead.
it, which taxiway we're going to take. You can see there's hot spots. It's going to be better if the applicant volunteers that information as opposed to the examiner having to, what is that circle? What is this? Someone would say, okay, I'm going right on Alpha. There's a hot spot. We're going to hold short of 21 right until we're cleared. That's the kind of heads up piloting we like to see. Failing that, we're always going to drag it out of you some way. We're going to ask questions. So volunteer what you know, and it'll be a better ride.
Okay, let's put that graphic back up again. Let's continue working on through it. Okay, obviously, and this one is in the ACS position, the controls for wind. Now, if you're flying a nose wheel airplane, really doesn't matter that much. If I can tell for you from experience, if the winds are enough that it really matters, you probably shouldn't be flying at all. If you're in a tail dragger, that's something else. But nonetheless, the ACS says you should position the controls properly based on the winds. So the examiner is going to be looking for it, so don't forget to do it. Taxi slow, there's no reason to go too fast. You want to make sure that you're going slow enough that you keep a good positive control on the airplane. If you keep the RPM setting between 900 and 1,000, that should be just about the right speed. And really focus, again, this is a low workload time period, low stress time. Focus on staying on that yellow line. As David says, he doesn't have anything else to do, so he's watching over the cowling to make sure that yellow line stays underneath the nose wheel.
Yeah,
okay.
That's good advice.
Okay, and I like the fact, David, when you pointed out that actually briefing the taxi diagram with the examiner, it's a double check for you to make sure that you understand the taxiing instructions, and it also shows a level of professionalism, and it lets the examiner see that you understand what the task is at hand.
Yeah, and I was telling you the other day, I've had a guy at his home airport he was cleared to 3-2, he turns and he's headed for 1-4, and I'm going, and that's not a failure. It's just, he's just shaking so bad. It's like, calm down. Where are we going? You give him a few, hints, and then we're off in the right direction finally. But you can't believe how nervous people get. So taking your time, talking through it is going to really help you settle your nerves. And, once the plane's flying, a lot of people finally start to calm down.
Yeah, that's
and I think talking through it, like David just mentioned, talking through it is huge. And what I like to really emphasize with my students is the examiner can't read your mind. So the more you can talk through what you're doing, and you don't want to talk too much, but just being able to walk through what it is that you're doing in a verbal way will help the examiner know what's on your mind. It will also help you not forget things. If you're stumped on a certain, if the examiner asks you a question and you know the answer and it's there and you've studied this and you're beating yourself up because you know you just went over this with your instructor, you just can't get it into the front of your brain. If you just start talking about it, a lot of times that can kind of work itself back in. So there's a few good ways to kind of beat the nerves, and I think that's a big one.
Gotcha, and it does make a lot of sense. Verbalize what's in your head. It's good for you. It makes sure that you have it right there, and it lets the examiner know that you know it. Okay, so we've taxied out. We've completed the run-up. Any comments about anything up in the run-up area, the little low-hanging fruit that we might take advantage of before we taxi on out to the whole short line? If not,
well, I did mention, I think when we were talking, that's frequently an error in the run-up when the examiner might ask more questions. What we're trying to do is take you to situations which might occur, and we want to see how you work through it and handle those sort of extemporaneously. You know, we might ask, okay, if you turned the mag to one position and you had no drop at all, is that a good thing? Is that even better than no drop? You know, and what's the excessive drop? As we're taxiing out, we might, you know, say, okay, I'm seeing a decrease in RPM. You know, as we're taxiing at a constant throttle setting, what's going on here? We might want to hear some discussion of carburetor heat and why it might happen. We're always looking to put you out of the ordinary and sort of see how you would handle those situations as a pilot, because that's where you're going to be. You're going to be a fully certificated pilot taking your friends and family flying, and we have to make sure you're going to do that safely. And so we're always pushing you a little on things that might happen, if that makes sense. And the run-up is a big place where that will happen to you. So make sure you know all the procedures, all the abnormals there, and you're ready to discuss that. Once the plane's in motion and we're flying, there's very little time for oral questions anymore, so we try to get them all out of the way before we get airborne.
Okay, but generally speaking, you know, the oral exam is usually carried out primarily in the FBO or back in the office before you leave.
Correct, but they always say, yeah,
it can still go on.
But, you know, it can continue, and it is your prerogative as the pilot in command, once you're in the air, is to say, you know, I'm busy flying a plane. Sometimes we'll throw a question at a very difficult time, and we want to see that student take charge of the plane and say, I can't talk right now, I'm busy, you know, doing this. That's perfectly okay.
Yeah, excellent point.
Yeah. Shut them up.
There was an examiner that was kind of famous around the Dallas, Texas area for offering a student a piece of candy or a piece of gum on final approach. And it's that you need, as the pilot in command, they're looking for you to, you know, safely fly the airplane and be the pilot in command. And so he was famous for offering a piece of gum, you know, right before a gear down checklist, or if it was a private check ride, just on final approach. Or say his phone's ringing, hang on 1 second, let me get that. Any abnormality that throws you off your loop and, you know, creates an unsterile cockpit and it's thrown you off your game a little bit, you know, they're looking for you to either shut them up or go around or say, you know, hey, let me finish this and, you know, take command.
That's a really important point, Nate. And, you know, we are looking more than anything to see that this person has transitioned from being a student to being in charge of that plane, to being pilot in command. It's one of the hardest things for people to do because you've got all that time sitting in the other seat, you know, and this is something, if CFIs are listening in here tonight, you got to make your student master of that plane incrementally so that when they get to that check ride, they're flying, they're in charge, and they'll tell the guy to shut up. You know, it's, you are the pilot of that plane. You are actually, it's your first hour of pilot in command time when you're flying with the examiner. You're logging pilot in command. So make sure you exhibit that to the examiner, and they will be not upset. They will be gratified to see that you're in charge.
Okay, that all sounds good. Yeah, the sterile cockpit thing makes a lot of sense too. And I'm sure, David, if you tried to engage a student in a conversation about about the family dog while you're taxiing out to the run-up area, and he told you to stop
Don't
talking,
take the bait.
Yeah. You're not going to hurt his
Don't
feelings.
take the bait. Yep.
Okay, well, we've taxied from the run-up area. We're out at the whole short line. We've been cleared for takeoff. Some obvious things, again, be thinking about. It's real easy. First of all, when you roll out, check your runway heading with your compass. It's real simple to do. The examiner's going to probably like seeing that you did something small like that. Another one, and we discussed this the other day, and David, I know this one is one that's important to you, is to have the candidate actually verbalize how he might handle problems during the takeoff roll. You know, if he loses an engine during the takeoff roll, does he have enough runway left? If he's in the air, what's he going to do if he loses power, land straight ahead? What's your comments about that?
That's a tough one, you know, because again, we do different things. We usually, I'm personally speaking for myself, on that first takeoff, I usually don't try to monkey with it because they're so nervous anyway. I don't want to create problems. But when I'm training pilots, and I still do teach, you know, I might pop a window open to see what they do, whether they, you know, get over there and try to fix it. They should have briefed that and said, you know, any problems on the takeoff roll, I'm going to probably abort the takeoff and come around and fix it. If the plane's rotated, we're going to fly the plane. But obviously, the briefing before the takeoff is critical because it puts you in that state of mind where you're ready for anything. I think we discussed, you know, takeoffs are, everyone gives them very little concern because it's hard to miss the sky. You know, add the power, little rotation, and up we go. It's, you know, it's probably the most toxic part of a flight, though. You're full of fuel, you're getting airborne, and statistically, it leads to a lot of problems. So on my check ride, on that first one, I usually don't do anything, but at some point in there, I'm going to create a problem on the takeoff roll. And if we go into things like multi-engine, it's required we pull an engine on the takeoff roll as we're getting. So we've got to be prepared for that.
Yeah, sure. I was thinking more along the lines not of what you as an examiner might do during the takeoff roll, but how the student or the candidate might verbalize his plans.
I see.
Well,
you know, when I taught students, it's always, you know, when we line up, it's, you know, we have a certain, you know, whatever your mantra might be, but you're checking the heading, oil pressure, oil temperature, any problems, we're going to do this, and you're ready to go. You really want to verbalize what your expectations are and what your immediate action would be in case of, you know, certain difficulties. Is that what you're thinking?
And if it's an airport that the student knows, you know, home airport, I usually try and make sure my students they've got an exact plan. So if we're taking off runway 5, and we know that airport from the back of our hand, and we know that there's a highway just to the, you know, just a sidestep off the runway center line. I mean, even if you can verbalize if the airplane, if we lose an engine below 1,000 feet, we're going to take a sidestep and land immediately on this highway. You know, if we're above 1,000 feet, we're going to turn back and come back to the runway. But actually having a specific point of I'm going to turn left and I'm going to aim for that highway. Having an exact plan of action. So there was no thinking involved. You've got it down. You've told the examiner you're ready for that emergency if it is to happen.
And if you brief it, it probably won't happen on Checkride.
Yeah, exactly.
So, no.
Hopefully.
Exactly.
I want to fly with your students, Nate. You really sound like you do a good job preparing them. Good for you.
Yeah, we have fun.
The door, David, you were talking about popping the window open. That's one of my favorites too. And I'll do that on flight reviews. It works especially easily if you're in a Cessna 172 or a 182. Because I can just put my left arm back around the seat over here and I can flip the window open. So I'll usually do that once they get up to about 20 or 30 or 40 knots in the takeoff roll, and 70% of the time they're going to reach over there and try to shut that window. So and I would not expect an examiner to do something like that during a check ride, but if you do have a door that pops open inadvertently during a takeoff roll, just ignore it. If you're going slow enough and you have plenty of runway, if you like, you can abort the takeoff. You can reject it. You can pull power off. You can taxi back and fix it. But if you're committed, just keep flying. It might be a little windier in there, and if it's winter, perhaps it might be a little colder. But if Take care of it later. You don't have to do it during the takeoff. Well, guys, we've been doing this about 35 minutes now. It's been a lot of fun. Our goal here, and I think we met it, was just to point out some simple, these low-hanging, easy items to do that can enhance your ability to have a successful practical test with an examiner. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. David, we appreciate SAFE's involvement and you being here. Nate, thanks for dropping in. Come on home now.
Absolutely.
And to everybody else, good flying.